So one of the purposes of the lecture is to introduce the new book, which we're very proud of and very excited about, the new developments in expressive arts therapy, the subtitle, The Play of Poesis. Actually, when I gave the publisher the title, we put The Play of Poesis first, but they wanted something that would directly relate to the series of expressive arts therapy. And it's a very interesting collection of essays, artworks, and poetry by many people who are here and others who are notable in this field. There's a wonderful interview, I think wonderful, with Paolo, where he really free-rangely talks about his life and his work and how he came to the ideas he has now. There's a couple of articles by Sean McNiff. There's stuff by Ellen and by me, and poetry by Elizabeth and Margot, I believe, and Sally Atkins. And all of the material is drawn from the journal some of you have seen in the bookstore, the Poesis journal. And in a way, the book is, if not a quintessence, at least a crystallization of the journal. And the journal was the journal of EGS for 16 years. And I think what we tried to do in the journal was something different than most arts therapies or expressive arts journals, in that we tried to make the journal itself an aesthetic thing, so that we included in the journal poetry, paintings, photographs, and we tried to have the articles, insofar as we could, have a kind of a poetic dimension to them. And I'm interested in the word essay, which the articles are, and the meaning of essay, which in English means also to try something. I essayed to do that. And it has the sense of an attempt, an experiment, trial is a word that comes to mind also. And I think the book itself is an essay in that sense. So I hope you will enjoy it, and I hope you will have many hours of reading and thinking from it. What I want to talk about, I'll also say that the book has several sections, and I think that's part of the work. It begins with a section on theory, where we try to think about the underlying ideas of the field. And then there's a long section on therapy, articles relating to the arts and therapy. Then there's one on education, including reflections on the educational work that we do here by Paolo and Margot and myself. And there's also one on social change and ecological action. And finally, one on research. So there's really a wide range of this. And I think that has something to do with the evolution of the field. It's extension from a purely therapeutic work to an approach that can be done or essayed, let's say, in many different ways. So what I want to talk about particularly is poiesis. This is a Greek word, which I first encountered, I think, in contemporary thinking in Heidegger's work. And I took it from there. And in a way, it's the concept of poiesis and the thinking around this concept are an attempt to do something that was talked about at Lesley many years ago, which was to find a theory indigenous to art. Because when expressive therapy started, we were dealing with the field of arts therapies in which psychology was the basis, and artworks were interpreted according to explanatory frameworks derived from psychological theories. And many of those are very interesting and insightful, but we felt there was something lacking in the understanding of the arts themselves. And we wanted to find a concept and a point of view that actually came from art making and was not imported from another direction. And also, personally, I must say, Ellen and I both had strong therapeutic trainings before we came to expressive arts. One of the things I noticed was that all the frameworks made sense, and all of them were different from each other. So there were psychoanalytic interpretive frameworks, Jungian interpretive frameworks, Gestalt, and you could just go on with it. And it was interesting, to see where people were coming from. But it felt like often they were missing this dimension of the spirit of the arts. So I went back to this concept of poiesis, which is a Greek word, and as I say, brought into contemporary discourse primarily through Heidegger, and started to think about, well, what do we mean by poiesis, and how is it different from the traditional concept? So I want to begin the first part of this lecture by talking about this traditional concept, because the word is used in Greek to mean all forms of making, all forms of production, of making, of shaping, and the arts then become a particular form. So it's not only related to art making, but it's to any kind of making. And it occurred to me, the more I thought about it, that in a way, human beings are shaping creatures. We shape the world in which we live, and that world then shapes us. Part of the reason for that is that we are not pre-adapted to any particular environment, as many species are. And that's, in a way, a challenge to us, because we have to find ways to live wherever we are in any circumstance. But it's also a resource, because it creates the situation in which we must make our world rather than just find it. So, for example, human beings can live in the Arctic, they can live in the Sahara, they can live on the farm, they can live in the city, and each time they're shaping the environment to meet their needs and responding to what they're given. I think that has a lot to do with it. So I see poiesis not just meaning art making, but as a fundamental way in which human beings are in the world, to actually shape the world to give us a place to live. And we can shape it very badly, as we know. A lot of the environmental crisis comes from what you might call malformed acts of poiesis, poiesis that leads to destruction. And it's a real question how we can find ways to live in this world without destroying it. And I think Paul Ansa has spent many years thinking about this, and perhaps he'll say something about it at the end. So, what is the traditional concept of poiesis? Because I think it's very problematic. It's not that we can just take it from the tradition. Well, it really begins with Plato and with his discussion of poiesis in the arts. And I think to understand Plato, you have to realize that he was writing in a time of great upheaval. He was coming from Athens, which had undergone a lot of civil war. There was a sense that nobody knew what the right way to live was. There was a danger of upsetting the order at any moment. And Plato was very influenced by the growth of mathematical science, in which was quite advanced in ancient Greece. I mean, it's really amazing when you think about it. Not in the application of mathematics to nature, but as a pure science itself. And what Plato saw was that the characteristics of mathematical objects are such that they are always the same. They're always the same in any place, with any person, and over time. So they have this quality of eternity and universality. For example, a circle is a circle, and the properties of a circle are the same, no matter whether you live in Athens or Sparta or contemporary Saas-Fee, whether the circle that you draw is small or large, whether it's drawn by a man or a woman or someone from Hong Kong or New York. It's always the same circle, and there's no such thing as, what shall I say, as Stalin tried to develop the idea of Soviet science, and he thought that he could find sciences that were very different from bourgeois science, but it was a total failure. There's only science. So with the beginnings of science in the form of mathematics, Plato found a model for truth. And for him, truth is that which does not change. Truth is that which is eternal and universal. And from that point of view, he looked for a concept of justice and a concept of the city or the polis, what we call the political concept, that would be have the same quality in a way as that of mathematical science. It would create order, it would be the same everywhere, and it would give us a secure foundation. And for that reason, I think, when he looked at poiesis in the arts, he was rather dismayed, because what he saw from his point of view was that the artist does not know in advance what he's doing. He doesn't have the kind of knowledge that you have in science. And the works that he makes, Plato thought, stir people's emotions. They appeal to the emotions, they stir the emotions, and they are far removed from truth. He thought of, if the forms that we're speaking of, these universal necessary forms, are eternal, then the arts are poor attempts to imitate these forms. Art he saw as a form of imitation, and he thought of it as basically harmful to human existence. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that Plato started off as a poet. And if you look at his work, you'll see that there are many poetic dimensions. His dialogues take place, well, they're dialogues, which is a dramatic form. They're embodied in characters. They are filled with metaphors. And always they end in myth, storytelling. So I like to say that Plato tried to banish poiesis from the city, but he couldn't banish it from himself. So his concept of poiesis is one that was carried on, in a way, within the philosophical tradition, because the arts were always seen as, at best, poor cousins of science, not bearing truth within themselves, but only as perhaps pointing to something that scientific knowledge could provide. Aristotle, following Plato, tried to find more of a justification for art making, particularly in his account of tragic drama, of tragedy. I'm sure you all know about that. And he found it in this idea of catharsis, the idea of purification. Catharsis, which was taken over later into psychological discourse, particularly by Freud and then by others, catharsis had two meanings. On the one hand, it meant purification. You had purification rituals in Greek religion, which were thought to be cathartic. But on the other hand, it had a medical meaning of purgation, literally vomiting, getting rid of whatever toxic element is in the body. And I think for Aristotle, the arts have a cathartic effect, because he saw them as purifying the emotions and eliminating the emotions which are troubling or disturbing to the society and to the individual. So this is a little bit different than the Platonic tradition, in that he saw the arts as beneficial, but its benefit is primarily to reintroduce order into the disorder of the polis, the disorder of the city. I'm going to take a drink now. No.
No, not yet. No.
Oh, he's taking a drink.
I get 30 seconds extra. And in the doctoral handbook of EGS, I wrote about Aristotle's notion that there are three ways of knowing. There's theory, which sees things, it's based on the idea of seeing. The word for theory comes from the word for seeing. And it gives you a concept of truth in which the observer is not involved. It's an objective truth. There's also knowing by knowing by doing, which is action. And that particularly pertains to ethical and political acts, in which we try to understand the consequences of what we're doing. And finally, there's poiesis, which he thought had a kind of knowing. Unlike Plato, he granted poiesis a kind of knowing, a knowing by making. But it's still a poor cousin to theory. Only theory can grasp the eternal universal form. And poiesis could have a good benefit for people's lives, but it will not give us the truth. So, yeah. So maybe I'll stop there, actually.
Okay. I don't know exactly what I'm doing, really. I'm just, I feel like I do something first, and then I kind of like follow the forms. Like I create structures, and then I just like, I don't know, just follow where they're going with my habits. Like people who've seen me paint before recognize my habits. I mean, I think every painter has a style or habits or how they, what forms seem to appear again and again. So a lot of times there's something going on underneath, and then there's something going on the top. And I don't know what's going on yet, but it's emerging. It's just emerging, and I'm just playing with it. That's all.
Who the hell do you think you are? This time you've gone crazy. This time you've gone too far. Everything calm and peaceful till you come along. Then you stir up my trouble, and all that peace is gone. Gone right out the window. Gone right into dark. Hear the babies cry and hear the wild dogs bark. Well, this is my poesis, and this is my soul. So, you just take it easy. You hear what I'm saying? You tried to banish me from your city, but you could not banish me from yourself. I'm your poesis, so get used to it.
I think. Okay, so is anyone else with faculty? Well, yeah. So we'll start again. We won't do the 15 minutes until I start talking. So, yeah? Okay. I think that's a very strong response from a beautiful person. Okay, well, if you look at the tradition of philosophy, you'll see that philosophers have always looked for what lasts, for what is eternal, and for what is the same for everyone, for what is universal. And there's a sense in which they were trying to transcend our human condition, because we don't have eternity in our hands. And we are all different from each other. And human beings form cultures, make cultures, and poetic acts, which are quite different. So it's the difference between the experience of life, which is an experience of becoming, an experience of what Plato called coming into being and passing away, and the object of philosophy, which traditionally has been not the opposite of becoming. It's become being. And being is always conceived of as the same. So as philosophical, there was always a counter stream in philosophy, but it didn't really, I think, crystallize itself until the work of Nietzsche in the 19th century. And maybe we could look for social or political reasons for his thinking, or psychological reasons, but I just want to talk about some of his ideas. Nietzsche saw philosophers as having a hatred of time. He thought that philosophy was an attempt to escape from time. And actually, he saw religion in the same way, religion's promise of eternal life. And he tried to think, what would it mean to think according to time, or to think time, to be timely or untimely in your thinking? And what conception of being would that lead to? And actually, Nietzsche's thinking in its mature form, began with his work as a student of classical languages. He was trained as a philologist, a student of language, and he was so distinguished by it that he became a full professor at the University of Basel at the age of 25, I believe. And what he discovered, of course, in Germany has a long tradition of love for Greek culture, almost an obsession with Greek culture. And so Greek tragedy was one of the forms that philosophers and literary critics studied the closest. And Nietzsche, as a classically trained philologist, also looked at Greek tragedy. Now, at that time, and for the most part in general, what you see when you look at tragedy is the text. We read Sophocles, we read Aeschylus, we read Euripides, and we're able to appreciate what, the beauty of their language and the strength of it, the articulate forms that it takes. More so, of course, if you can read the original, which I can't. But even in translation, it comes across, the well-formed work of the classical tragedians. And in German culture, there was this sense that Greece was represented by clarity of thinking, clarity of vision, by the bright sun that shines in Greece, this sense of beauty that comes from seeing, and that was the way, that would be what we were longing for, in the northern countries. And I think Nietzsche was able to see through that. And he asked himself, well, what is tragedy? What is Greek tragedy? And the answer is that Greek tragedy is not a text. Greek tragedy is a play. It's a drama. It takes place. And it takes place within the context of a particular ritual dimension of the festival dedicated to the god Dionysus, which is true. I think it was a 12-day. I'm not remember how many days of the festival, but it was an annual event in Athens and other cities in honor of Dionysus, and at the culmination of which there would be the performance of tragic dramas, which incidentally were always presented as in competition. You would have 3 dramatists selected, and they would compete, and they would put on their plays. The city would furnish them the possibility, and then the judges would decide who has the best, who's the best, who wins. And that's where the idea of the laureate comes from, because the laurel wreath would go to the winner. So Elizabeth's our poet laureate. I don't know if she's a tragedian or not, but certainly deserves that laurel wreath. And Nietzsche said, well, what is a tragedy? What is it that became a center for Greek culture itself, that the whole city devoted its energies over almost a 2-week period to it? And it was so important to civic life that at one point they decided they would pay people to come. People who couldn't afford the price of it could actually be paid by the city. You were required to be at the tragic festival because it's a civic occasion. And Nietzsche said, well, tragedy is not a text. Tragedy is a performance. And what kind of performance is it? It's a performance that takes place which is based on music and dance. We read the Greek tragedies and come upon the parts. If you've read Greek tragedy, you know that there are not only protagonists, there are not only actors, there are also a chorus. And the words of the chorus are transcribed in the text. But in fact, they're very often incomprehensible. We can't figure out what is the chorus doing there? Why is it coming in? What's the point? Why don't we just have these beautiful speeches by the protagonists in the play? And Nietzsche's understanding was that, well, actually, these beautiful speeches, these articulate forms of Greek language, were based on the music and dance of the chorus. The choral song was something that was enacted through ritual, through dance, and also through singing. So he saw Greek tragedy. I mean, it's an insight into Greek tragedy, but he then generalized it. But he saw Greek tragedy the articulate form of language as based on the more embodied forms of music and dance. And from there, he developed a whole understanding of human existence. Human existence is not based on form. It's actually based on embodied action. And the embodied action, can give rise to articulate form. So for that reason, he thought of these different dimensions of human existence as what he called the Dionysian and the Apollonian. And choosing to embody his ideas in the form of images, which is itself a poetic act. So, Dionysus and Apollo, the two gods that he saw as embodying Greek culture. The literary thinking of the time is that Greek culture was very well-formed, it was clear, it provided a clear understanding, and all those characteristics belong to the god Apollo. Apollo is the sun god, representing that clarity of vision, but also the god of law and the god of understanding, of logos, the concept of understanding through language. So those are some of the characteristics of Apollo that seem to fit the text of the plays. Dionysus, on the other hand, is a god of festivity. He's the wine god. He's the nature god. He's a god who actually is torn apart by his devotees and then comes back to life again. He's a god of creativity and also of destruction. And destruction primarily for those who do not welcome him into their lives, which is a very interesting concept. If you read the Bacchae, this play by Euripides, you'll see that the ruler of the city, whose name I've suddenly forgotten, Paul, can you help me? Anyone help me with that? Anyway, the ruler of the city tries to exile Dionysus, which is a little bit like what Plato tried to do with the poets. And Dionysus comes and takes his revenge.
Remember who was the ruler?
Yeah, who was the ruler? I can't remember. Bacchae, which means, Bacchae were, I'm not sure the derivation of the word, but Bacchae were the devotees of Dionysus. They were women. I mean, that's an interesting thing, too. Dionysian religion was... Huh? Pantheist. Yeah. All right. So I actually was just testing to see if Ellen was listening. Yeah. The Bacchae were women devotees. Dionysus is the god of women, primarily. And not even the god of the city. The devotees would enact Dionysian rituals outside of the city, in the countryside. And they would only be admitted at times of festivity, like the tragic festivals, which is an interesting thing. I mean, Apollo is a very masculine god. He's, strong, clear, creates order, rules over cities. And Dionysus is like, whoa, let's dance. Actually, we have two divisions in EGS. It's easy to forget them if we don't see the other one. But the other division called Pact, Philosophy, Art, and Critical Thought. And there was a guy from Pact who was actually trying to chat up one of the women in our program. And he was not very good at it. And he once referred to the people in our program as dancing bunnies. So, and the woman he was speaking to said, well, in that case, the students in your program, they're all at the time dressed in black, all smoking like chimneys, all hunched over their computers. They're smoking corpses. So you have the dancing bunnies and the smoking corpses. And actually, the next night, I thought that the Aladdin Hotel created a perfect synthesis when they served, this is actually true, roast rabbit. So, So Nietzsche is often thought of as, a Dionysian thinker, but he was very clear, at least in his work before he actually went mad, it was very clear that he saw the Dionysian as the basis. It was nature, life, the body, song, festivity, and Apollonian life is based upon that. So what he would say is, for example, bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is an Apollonian form without any Dionysian element in it at all. It's pure Apollo, and as a result, I think it's very destructive. But he was not advocating that everybody should just party all the time, although, well, let's not get into that. But for him, the party is something that has a form or a structure, and I think that's a really important aspect of it, that the Dionysian life needs to be structured, framed, formed, in order to embody itself, in order not to dissipate or turn on itself and become destructive. Because after all, there are many forms of chaos which are quite destructive. For example, exile, migration, becoming a refugee. Everything is torn apart, but there's nothing that holds it together. So people have to find ways, or we have to find ways for people to reform. Okay, so following Nietzsche, I would just, hitting the highest point, so to speak, I would just point to Heidegger's work. And Heidegger is a very complex, ambivalent, ambiguous thinker, because he was a beautiful thinker and someone who really probed, I think, into very many unthought dimensions of our lives. But he was also a Nazi, and here, a supporter of Hitler very early on. And he was, in some ways, he was, you could say, pardon me, a real shit, anti-Semite, and turned on his teacher, Edmund Husserl, who came from a Jewish family, and upheld all the Nazi edicts. But at the same time, his thinking, particularly as it developed, became more and more poetic. So it's a paradox. I have not resolved it, nor to my mind has anyone else. Because people either say, well, Heidegger, forget about it, or let's forget about the politics. But I don't think you can do either one. But what is Heidegger's distinction? Well, his first book, excuse me, let me just put down the names for people who come from other languages and other cultures. I'll just say a little more before we turn it over to Ellen and the crew. Heidegger's first major book is called Being and Time. And this was a revolution in thinking. Heidegger was a phenomenologist. He was trained by Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology. But Husserl still had the ideal of a timeless, eternal science. He called it a rigorous science, where everything could be demonstrated by evidence. It's a lot like the evidence-based material that psychology journals are looking for, all trying to show that you can demonstrate the value of the work. But Heidegger said, well, what if truth is not eternal? What if truth is temporal? What if it changes in time? What if human beings live in time? And of course we do. What if our existence is not that of a pure consciousness, as it was for many in the philosophical traditions, such as Descartes, but is an embodied existence, and an existence in a world, and in a world with others. So Heidegger's thinking in Being and Time is much closer to our experience of what it means to be human. And he said that his word for human being, Dasein, which means existence, or, the existing human being is a being in the world, and a being in the world with others. And this opened up philosophy in a beautiful way. But it also creates certain problems, because it means that truth is only the truth of the time in which you live. There's no truth that transcends the time. But the goal is to find in the time in which we live those possibilities for becoming which are authentic, which actually are suited to existence. And particularly for Heidegger, what is fundamental to our existence is the fact that we will die, that we were all mortal, not as a fact in the world, but as some experience that we have, that we can grasp. When everything we're involved in, all the busyness of the world, all the tasks and preoccupations and lists that we cross off the to-do list, when that suddenly falls away, we're face to face with our own mortality. And this is an experience where he thought of nothingness, our own nothingness, that we actually are, that death is something that you could say is inscribed within us. And that a lot of our civilization is an attempt to escape from death. There's a wonderful book by Ernest Becker called The Denial of Death, particularly about America, in which he says American culture is just based on a fear of and a denial of death. And all the obsession with longevity and ways to be healthy, demonstrate that. And putting sick people, out of sight, and dead people, putting them away and not spending too much time with them. So for Heidegger, if you really grasp our mortality, not in the form of a logical syllogism as Aristotle did when he said, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. No, Heidegger was saying it's not logic, it's existence. And our existence then has this element of, you might say, fragility to it. And we cannot escape that, we have to embrace it. I think I'll pause here for a minute because I've been going on for a bit, and I want to say how Heidegger transitions. Maybe I won't say it. Speak, oh poet, poetic. Alejo asked me if you can be throwing things. I said, no.
I did it for you. I don't know what I'm doing here, really. But one thing that happened that was kind of interesting was what happened in here. That I was putting some tissue over in these boxes. Is somebody describing to Sarah what I'm doing? Yeah, you are? Okay. So I put this piece of tissue down and I was pressing it, and then I peeled it off, but I realized the back of it was much more interesting than just having a blob of tissue. So there are these kind of like hidden forms in the tissue paper that I find really, really interesting. And there's something wrong with this painting. Somehow, I don't know what the relationship is between these two parts. Something, I don't know. And whether I start to make a bridge, like somehow the earth underneath, like there's a bridge, like what's going on under here? Is it going to come up a little bit or not? I don't know. And the other thing I like to do a lot is take materials. Oh, I forgot my. Yes. I love using this stuff, this corrugated cardboard. So, and also turning it into, painting it gold and turning it into something that looks really precious, but it's really garbage. I like to do that. So I'm still working on something to do with the relationship of this lower part to the upper part. It's completely disconnected. So let's see what happens. The problem is also, I'm working with water-based paint. I wondered if I should work with acrylics, but they do dry faster. So, well, this could be a complete flop as a painting or not. We'll see. Ellen? Yeah.
You said you didn't know what you were doing?
Yeah.
I can show you.
God.
So Heidegger's early thinking, getting back to that, really had this concept that it's only in facing our own death as our own, realizing the possibility of my impossibility, that I can be authentically who I am. And the whole concept of authenticity comes from Heidegger, by the way. But he did not mean being sincere, which is what it usually means for us. And I think there's a danger in this kind of thinking because it easily leads to a glorification of death. And the battle cry of the Spanish rebels under Franco was "Viva la muerte," long live death. So, and I think there was this sense of, in Heidegger and maybe in Germany at the time, that bourgeois culture is superficial and it's hiding the essence of our lives, and we have to grasp it and show that we are not afraid. So what's interesting about Heidegger is that as his thinking developed and as his life developed, he started to withdraw more and more from Nazi politics. It's clear that the Nazi movement did not embody what he saw as an authentic existence. And he was actually ruled out of the university, kept from teaching anymore. And he moved to a little cabin in the Black Forest, and he wrote essays. This Being in Time is a very systematic work, very complex, and actually terrific in that way. But it doesn't have a poetic dimension to it. But his essays do, and he started to think about the arts, and particularly poetry. And he started to ask himself, well, how does truth come to be? If truth is not something that is eternal and universal, then where can we find it? And his answer, interestingly enough for us, is that it comes through art making. That the work of art is an embodiment of truth because it shows the world and the self as they are. It can reveal parts of ourselves that have not been disclosed before. And he talks about it primarily in terms of painting and poetry, but I think also of novels, and all the novels I've read, which give me more insight into what it's like to be alive today, what it's like to be a man or a woman, what it's like to come from another country or to be a migrant or a refugee. I suddenly see things that I didn't see before. So for Heidegger, there's this sense in which truth comes to be. It's not there that we copy it. It's something that we make. We actually make truth. By disclosing the essence of what is around us and of ourselves. And in doing this, we also draw upon a foundation which we can't control. So he came up with this concept of world, which is everything around us, the world we live in, the cultural, historical, natural world, and earth, which is the basis of the world. It's not only the actual earth of nature, but it's everything in our existence which can't be articulated, which doesn't take a definite form, which is something that we're aware of but can't grasp exactly. And he saw this as a conflict between world and earth, which emerges in what he called the structure, or gestalt, the figure of the work. And the figure of the work has moments of clarity, of world revealing, but it also reveals a dark dimension which we can't quite grasp, but which makes it possible for future creators to emerge from and to develop the work in a new way. That's why we never come to understanding completely any work of art. We can't say that, oh, now I know what Van Gogh's paintings are. No, it's like there's always new interpretations are always possible. And it seems to me that this is very close to the distinction Nietzsche makes between Dionysus and Apollo. Dionysus representing the earth, and Apollo representing the clarity of the relationships and the significations that form our world. And what I want to do now is turn towards the relationship between this concept of poiesis as founded on Dionysian life, giving birth to Apollonian form, or the emergence of a world that is based upon an earth that supports it, and think of it in terms of the work of expressive arts. So I do want to show that this has some relationship to your work. Because it seems to me that what expressive arts, in the tradition in which we experience it, starting from the 70s at Leslie and coming to Switzerland as well, is the tradition of a Dionysian tradition. It has that sense of the body, it has that sense of celebration, of festivity, of community. Apollo is very much the god of the individual, differentiating one individual from another. But Dionysus is the god of collective celebration. And you can see in community art a real form of that. And yet at the same time, there's an Apollonian dimension, because it always has to have a frame. Jacques Stittelman, who is the director of the program in Geneva called L'Atelier, has just written a book in French called The Concept of Form, the concept de cadre in the arts therapies. And what he wants to show is that the form is what makes possible the life within it. Without the form, it's not just doing whatever you want, it's or just not pure chaos. It's chaos within a form. You see the same thing in the concept of liminality, because liminality, in order to be productive, liminality refers to that space in between stages of life, in between the seasons, in between any situation we're into where we don't understand what's going on and we don't have control over it. But when there's a form that guides liminality, it can be productive, creative dimension. If not, it can really be destructive. And the refugee crisis is a good example of destructive liminality. So not all chaos is wonderful. A lot of chaos is murder, it's injustice, it's poverty, And I think we have to remember that. But the opposite, the way to deal with that is not to try to find these rigid forms that everything can fit into. It's to find the creative dimension which underlies living creatures in every way. And I think that's what happens, for example, in the decentering part of an expressive arts session, or a decentering aspect of any social change which really leads to greater productive life. There's always a frame for a decentering. It needs to be contained, and the containment is partially by the materials, by time, space, and objects, but also by the relationship between, in therapy, the therapist and the client, so that we understand what can be done, what can't be done. Even with children, the rules of what can be done. No breaking windows, no hitting, and yet within that frame, everything is possible. So, and I think this also corresponds, I'll try to be brief at this point, I think this also corresponds to developments in the arts. So the emergence of expressive arts reflects not only a new understanding of what art making is, but it also corresponds to movements in the arts themselves, in which the body comes into play in a way that it hasn't before. We spent a lot of time with a particular teacher of physical theater, Philippe Gaulier, and one of the things that Gaulier always said was, movement first, text after. So the text has to come from the movement. And I think one of the great virtues of Elizabeth's work is that she's brought poetry back to the oral tradition in which the body and the voice and song and movement are really the focus and not disembodied words on the page. It's living art. So I think and also in postmodern tendencies in the arts, there's a great, I'm sort of crushing things together very quickly here. There's a great emphasis upon bringing together different traditions, different forms, interdisciplinary work, polyaesthetic work, and also on not knowing, on improvisation, on the discovery through the work, like Ellen's painting. You know, she says she doesn't know beforehand, and yet forms are emerging. She's letting them emerge. And I would even say that the point which I would like to end with, perhaps, is this idea that what we're doing in expressive arts, whether it's therapy or coaching or social change or ecological change, what we're doing is not imposing a form, a preformed conception on matter, whether it's the form of normality in therapy or whether it's the form we think people need in the social dimension, but we're responding to whatever is emerging from those with which we're working. So when you're working in therapy, you know, there's a certain point where you have to let go of all your ideas and let go of your will to control what's happening and just be present and help the person go where they need to go. And I think that's the same thing in different activities as well, such as social change. We all know how ineffective it was for example, Trotskyists to stand by factory gates and hand out leaflets telling the workers what they need to do. But people who go into community organizing, for example, first thing they learn is to listen to the people, to ask them what they need, what's standing in their way, and what their possibilities are. So I think all of this has to do with a different concept of poiesis that is rooted in the body, that is rooted in the community, that allows us to let go of control and to trust, as Sean McNiff likes to say, the process. Not all processes are good. Avalanche is also a process. But a process that's framed properly can be incredibly beneficial to everybody. Maybe I'll stop there and give chance for responses. Want to give a little bell, Melly? Lady.
There it is. For now, you know, something, I don't know what is coming along. It's interesting how dark I felt it was. It was just, I just felt I was drowning in darkness for a while, and then I just felt like I had to bring it alive, and then the green had to go over, right?
Yes.
The green. After Greer gave me that feedback, I just realized the green. There it is.
Uh-huh.
It's the green that brings it up and sort of out and gets away from this division, in a sense, between up and down, or bifurcation of worlds, or whatever you want to say. Bringing it a little more together, perhaps. And these floating things, I put windows and ladders very often in my paintings. I like those images. So these look to me like little windows. And I don't know what we're looking at through the windows, but that's it.
Well, I'm going to set a feedback and then Paul can
Oh, okay. More?
if there's anyone else. I go. Marcus.
I start at the beginning when community art was still with me. So the first one is actually dedicated to the community art we did together. The rising sun. We turn into rocks, we turn into birds, we turn around to land into the rising sun, to land into each other's hand, redirecting ourselves anew. The second one, poiesis, or how it began. Something were lacking. Something was different. Something was missing. Where was the spirit of the arts? Who makes colors shining, red, yellow and green? Who gives words a poetic touch? Who breathes heaven into Johann Sebastian Bach's music? Who ensouls our creating hands? The third, what for the arts? Art is neither good nor bad. Art is neither emotion nor thought. Art is neither male nor female. Art is what is with us. Art is what will survive us. Art is mother. A mother who sends us out to the world, wanting us to serve the unspeakable, to serve the silenced, to serve what keeps us alive. The last one, inspired by Heidegger's notion that our life we are living towards death. We all are mortal. Sometimes we forget it. Other times it hits us strongly. Tears. Weep for me. Tears. Weep for us. Tears. Weep for our lost loves. Tears. Tears. Bring us closer to what we love.
Yes. Thank you.
I'm going to need everybody for this one.
No?
So it takes 1 minute, and the choreography is that you start with your feet like this, and then it goes faster and faster and faster, and then for the last 10 seconds or so, you rise up, and the hands come up. So it's 1 minute. I'll lead you in it, and we're all going to...
1 minute for the whole.
The whole thing will take 1 minute.
Good.
And this is an aesthetic response to both Steve and Ellen. And the name of this piece is Pay Attention to Those Rumblings from Beneath. Bravo!
I just want to say one more thing. You know, I was very impressed by the work of Hannah Arendt, the German Jewish philosopher, right? Who had an affair with Heidegger, I believe. And she came up with the concept of natality. And natality means birth. You know, the word natal means birthplace. And she said, what's characteristic of human being is not death, but birth. Bringing something new into existence. And maybe that's something that a woman would particularly do with. Paul.
Thank you.
Yeah, she's great, thank you.
Okay, well, as usual, Steve, I have far too much to say, and would happily continue to give another entire lecture in response to your lecture and to Ellen's painting. I can't resist my urge to actually speak to the painting, first of all, and over the years I've done this a number of times with Steve and Ellen, and I always have this tremendous urge to see if I can subvert Ellen's contention that there's really no relationship between her painting and the lecture. So now I'm going to show that there is a relationship. And we start with our two main characters here, Dionysus and Apollo. And it does seem to me that there is a kind of interesting interplay between those two impulses in your process and in the work as it emerged, Ellen. So beginning with Dionysian disorder, which, as Nietzsche said, really is the substructure, what lies beneath in the Apollonian order. Scribbledy scribble, scribbledy scribble, all over. Kind of clearing the blank field and filling it with Dionysian chaos. Then a countervailing Apollonian impulse to kind of steamroller over all that chaos with a nice, good, clear, solid blue color. Except not quite. Some of it, a little bit was showing through, and there were these sort of openings here with a bit of interesting sort of chaos lying behind them, which now has beginning to get a kind of frame around it too, which is interesting for a way for it to be, and then something happening down here, which has been kind of pushed out of this orderly realm, but it's starting to sort of stick its way up in a kind of rough, uncertain sort of way. What's going on down there? And then the windows begin to get kind of framed in a little bit more, and we begin to see that there's really two places here. There's this kind of orderly, somewhat orderly place here, kind of blue block, which almost looked to me at a distance as being a bit like an apartment building or something like that. Down here we've got these things coming up, and we begin to get some green around them. And there was a moment where I was beginning to feel that, well, it begins to look kind of like the city up here and the natural world down there, you know, the world up here and the earth down there. Pretty clear line between them. And then, I was very interested because there was a sort of gestalt I could see there. And then Ellen went back and looked at it and clearly didn't like something about that. And I believe probably Ellen was the same thing that I and maybe others found dissatisfying, was that these realms were so separated, and it was kind of hard to see how they connected with each other. And I was thinking also, well, yeah, and the city and nature, like, big line between them, there's something wrong with that, That's like a bad way to put the world together. And so you came back, and you begin to find a way to let the green move move up into this place, this orderly place of the cultural world, where nature begins to move in, and moreover, this thing that looks so much like an apartment block begins to become a little bit more like the open sky. It still has its orderly frames in it, and we have the green penetrating up into this world. So I began to see that, first of all, as a kind of interpenetration of Apollo and Dionysus, a sort of marriage of Apollo and Dionysus, and also for me, as someone very interested in environmental issues and the question of a new vision of the way we are going to organize our society in a world that's going to be sustainable and at the same time humanly rich and rewarding. It seemed to me that we have here a kind of a fusion of the natural world and the world of human habitation. They begin to become part of the same place, and that place takes on a beauty that wasn't there before, which I believe is what you've arrived at in the painting finally. So that's my attempt to put the two of them together, and I think probably that also means I'm out of time.
And that's what you just did. It's a good example of phenomenology. Yeah. Well, thanks for your attention, everybody. And
Just to say one more thing.
Yeah,
Do you
please.
have the book with you?
yes, I do.
I just want to show it with pride. A birthing of a book is a big job. Even though the articles were already written, we had to edit each one again. We had to make some decisions, of course, about which one should go in, because 16 journals with many, many articles, we had to make choices. And then I also want to point out that there is artwork in here. It's not the greatest resolution that I would have loved to have had, but its artwork is in here, and there's poetry. So it really does try to crystallize the essence of the journal.
So it's out.
So it's out now, it's birthed now, it's available now, so if you want a copy, we'll be happy to sign a copy if you want to buy it here. It's also available on Amazon if you want to wait and buy it later with a credit card. I found it.
I suggest you get the signature in it because it will be a collector's item.
I think we're becoming collectors.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, wait. I think Gerhard wants to say something.
Okay.
I only want to thank you for everything and everybody for this wonderful morning in this room to be with you. And I want to leave all the greetings of our International Society for Poiesis Education. And I would very, very be pleased, and I would like to come closer with our works in next time, because I think there is so many how we can meet another. And what I got an impression is not only poiesis, but behind poiesis there is even praxis and catharsis, and even I think it is a lot of contemplation. We need just in our time now. And what I appreciate most is when I was watching you painting here, it is so different from the moment I would buy a painting, because I only could look at the surface. But art for me, and the process of art, is like an onion. There are so many shapes, and you can put on one and you find the next one. And you can find it if you are there when art happens. And I think that's one of the selling points at your work here and our work. Let's be there when art happens.
That's great. I like that.
What I wanted to tell is, sometimes I think Heidegger would never have said some of his sentences without meeting Hannah Arendt. I think that's even a point. And I want to thank you, and my life would never be the life it is if I never had met Paulo Knill. Thank you very much.